The winter of 1878 came down on the Dakota plains not like a blanket, but like a hammer. It was a cold that did not creep. It struck. It shattered the stillness of the air with a force that made the stoutest timber groan and the hardiest men question their resolve. In the small, hopeful settlement of Providence, huddled by a shallow bend in the ungenerous Graywood River, the cold was more than a season. It was a predator, a relentless stalker that found every crack, every chink, every moment of inattention. The wind that carried it was a tireless engine of misery, a vast, invisible river of ice that flowed from the north without pause, scouring the land and the soul. The settlers of Providence were not strangers to hardship. They were a collection of stubborn dreamers, second-son farmers, and hopeful immigrants who had traded known miseries for the unknown promise of their own land. They had built their settlement with the materials at hand: sod for the first desperate shelters, and then timber, hauled from the thin groves that clung to the riverbanks. Their cabins were monuments to their own grit, squared logs chinked with a mixture of mud, moss, and prayer. They were built according to the wisdom they had carried with them, the same designs that had served their fathers and grandfathers in the gentler, more forgiving climates to the east. But this land was different. This land did not forgive. The cold here had teeth, and it chewed through their conventional wisdom as if it were dry grass. The log cabins, which should have been sanctuaries, became frigid tombs. The chinking would shrink and crack in the deep freeze, opening 100 tiny mouths for the wind to whistle through. Frost would bloom on the inside of the walls, delicate, beautiful patterns of ice that mocked the fire roaring in the hearth. The heat from the stoves fought a losing battle, rising to the rafters, while the floors remained so cold that a pail of water left overnight would be a solid block by morning. The community's struggle was a shared, communal rhythm of suffering. The sound of the axe was constant, a desperate percussion against the howl of the wind. A family's wealth was not measured in coin or land, but in the height and breadth of its woodpile. They burned through fuel at a terrifying rate, the carefully stacked cords of summer vanishing like snow on a hot stone. Men would return from the woods, their beards frozen solid, their faces masks of red, chapped skin, hauling sledges with loads that seemed mountainous, yet would prove to be pitifully inadequate. Inside the cabins, families huddled together, wrapped in every blanket and quilt they owned, their breath pluming in the air. Sickness was a constant shadow, a cough in the night that could turn into a fever by dawn. The old and the very young were the most vulnerable, their hold on life as fragile as a pane of frosted glass. They had survived the previous winter, but barely. They had emerged in the spring, pale and thin, like creatures from a burrow, blinking in the unfamiliar sun. They had buried 3 of their own, 2 infants and an old man whose heart had simply given up in the face of the unending chill. The memory of that winter was a ghost that lingered through the bountiful summer and the golden autumn. Now, as the first killing frosts laid their white shroud upon the prairie, that ghost walked among them again, its cold breath a premonition of the trial to come. They did what they knew how to do. They chinked their walls again, they stacked their wood higher, and they prayed harder. They were trapped in a cycle of effort and failure, armed with traditions that were no match for the brutal reality of their new home. Among them lived a woman named Aara. She was a widow, her husband taken by a fever 2 summers past, leaving her with 2 small children, a boy named Caleb and a girl named Anna. Aara was quiet and kept to herself, a fact that the community mistook for fragility. She was an outsider in more ways than one. She had come with her husband from a land of high, wind-swept hills and stony coasts, a place where the winters were long and the people had learned to live with the wind, not just fight it. Her ways were different. Her accent was a soft melody against the flat tones of the plains, and her knowledge was not their knowledge. As the settlement prepared for the coming freeze in the familiar ways, Aara did not. She did not spend her days rechinking the small, inadequate cabin her husband had built. She did not join the men hauling wood from the river. Instead, she was seen walking the low rise of land just west of the settlement, pacing, staring at the ground, sometimes kneeling to crumble the soil between her fingers. She carried a book with her, a small, leather-bound volume filled with her father's spidery script and precise, angular drawings. It was a book of old ways, of building not against the land, but with it. One afternoon, Silas, the settlement's unofficial leader and most experienced builder, saw her marking lines in the dirt with a long stick. He was a good man, practical and proud, a man who believed in the tangible strength of a well-axed log and a square corner. He approached her, his brow furrowed with a mixture of concern and paternal condescension. "Aara," he said, his voice kind but firm. "There is little time for drawing in the dirt. The cold is coming. Your cabin needs more wood, and the north wall needs new chinking. We can spare a man to help you." Aara looked up from her work. Her face was calm, her eyes clear. "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice steady. "But I will not be spending another winter in that cabin. It is a sieve for the wind. It consumes wood and gives back only smoke and cold." She pointed with the stick to the lines she had drawn on the ground. They formed a strange shape, a deep rectangle with a rounded back, dug into the slope of the hill itself. "I will build my home here." Silas stared at the drawing, then at her, then back at the drawing. He could not make sense of it. It looked less like a house and more like a grave. "Build what?" he asked, a note of disbelief creeping into his voice. "A root cellar? A storm shelter? That is not a house, Aara." "It is a house," she replied patiently. "It is an earthen home. 3 sides will be sheltered by the hill. The earth itself will be my walls. It will hold the warmth from a small fire, and the wind will pass over it as if it were just another part of the land." She spoke of thermal mass, of the insulating power of soil, of angling a structure to cheat the prevailing wind. The words were foreign to Silas. Concepts from a world of engineering and ancient wisdom he could not comprehend. He shook his head, a slow, sad gesture. "That is folly. You will bury your children alive. A house needs to stand tall. It needs walls of thick timber to break the wind. It needs a proper foundation on flat ground. You cannot live in a hole in the ground like a badger. It is damp. It is dark. It will be a tomb." He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who had only ever known one way to do things. His way. The right way. News of Aara's plan spread through Providence like a prairie fire. It became the talk of the settlement, a source of grim amusement and genuine concern. "The widow has lost her senses," one woman said over her mending. "Grief has unsettled her mind." The men, gathered at the small trading post, were more blunt. "A mud house," one scoffed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "She will suffocate in her own smoke, or the roof will collapse under the first heavy snow, and that will be the end of it." The laughter was not always cruel, but it was constant. It was the laughter of people who faced a terrifying, shared enemy and found a strange comfort in their shared, traditional methods of fighting it, however ineffective they might be. Aara's idea was a deviation from the norm, a crack in their unified front of suffering. It felt like a betrayal of their collective struggle. If they all had to suffer in their cold, drafty cabins, then so did she. Her attempt to find a different way was an unspoken criticism of their own inability to do so, and they met it with ridicule. Silas, feeling a sense of responsibility, tried to reason with her again. He gathered 2 other respected elders and went to her plot of land. They found her not drawing, but digging. She was using a spade and a wheelbarrow, her movements steady and efficient, her face set with a quiet determination. She had already carved a significant hollow out of the hillside. Her children, Caleb and Aara, were nearby, gathering stones into a small pile. "Aara, we beg you to reconsider," one of the elders said. "This is madness. You have no man to help you lift beams. You have no knowledge of proper construction. You are putting your children in mortal danger." "My knowledge is different from yours, but it is not ignorance," she answered, pausing to wipe a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. The autumn air was crisp, but the labor was hard. "In my father's land, this is how the shepherds have lived for 1,000 years. Their homes do not fight the wind, they bow to it. They do not fight the cold, they accept the embrace of the earth to temper it. My husband built our cabin with your knowledge. I honor his hard work, but I will not let my children freeze because of it." Silas saw the book lying open on a flat rock, its pages held down by a stone. The drawings were intricate, showing cross-sections of walls, roof structures layered with sod, and clever designs for flues that drew smoke without stealing heat. To him, it was incomprehensible theory, the scribblings of a dreamer. He dealt in the solid reality of logs and iron nails. "Paper plans will not keep out a blizzard, Aara," he said, his voice heavy with finality. "We will not help you do this. We cannot be a party to such a foolish endeavor." He turned and walked away, the other men following him. It was a declaration. She was on her own. The isolation did not deter her. It seemed to fuel her. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Aara worked with a relentless, quiet diligence. The settlement watched her, the mockery slowly giving way to a kind of grudging, fascinated pity. They saw a lone woman and 2 small children toiling from sunup to sundown on a project that every sensible person knew was doomed to fail. The first part of her labor was the excavation. She dug into the south-facing slope of the hill, a location she had chosen with great care. It would receive the full benefit of the low winter sun and be shielded from the merciless north wind by the bulk of the hill itself. The work was grueling. The soil was dense, woven with a tough net of prairie grass roots. She dug with a spade, loosened the earth with a mattock, and hauled it away 1 wheelbarrow at a time, creating a growing pile that she would later use for the berms. Caleb and Aara, too small for the heavy work, did what they could. They cleared small rocks, pulled at stubborn roots, and brought their mother water. They worked as a small, determined unit, a tiny island of focused effort in a sea of skepticism. While Aara dug, the rest of Providence was engaged in their own winter preparations. The sound of Silas's hammer rang out as he helped a newly arrived family erect another identical log cabin, a box of wood to fight the cold. They worked quickly, eager to get a roof up before the first snow. The logs were notched and fitted with practiced speed, but the gaps were still there. The chinking was slapped on, a temporary seal against the inevitable siege. They built what they knew, reinforcing their shared vulnerability with every log they placed. They saw Aara's slow, deliberate digging and scoffed at her pace. "She will be living in a hole in the ground when the first blizzard hits," they said, "and we will be by our fires." After weeks of digging, the hollow was complete. A rectangular space about 20 feet long and 14 feet wide, with a 3-foot deep trench for the foundation. Aara then began the next phase, laying the stone. The children's small pile of rocks was a start, but she needed much more. She hitched a small cart to the family's old ox and made slow, arduous trips to the riverbed, collecting smooth, flat stones. She laid them carefully in the trench, fitting them together like pieces of a puzzle, creating a dry stone foundation that would not heave in the frost. This was a step the other builders in Providence often skipped, laying their first logs directly on the leveled ground, a shortcut that led to shifting walls and broken seals. Upon this stone foundation, she began to build her walls. The back wall and the two side walls were to be subterranean, built against the excavated earth. For these, she used the largest, flattest stones she could find, creating a thick, solid retaining wall. The front wall, the one facing south, was the only one that resembled a traditional cabin. She used the logs from her husband's old cabin, painstakingly dismantling it piece by piece. She re-notched them, fitting them together with a precision that surprised even herself, using skills she had watched her father employ years ago. She was not just building, she was remembering. The most crucial part of her design was something the others could not see. Behind the stone retaining walls, she left a narrow air gap before the packed earth, a clever detail from her father's book. This gap would prevent the dampness of the soil from leaching directly into the stonework, keeping the interior dry. For insulation, she packed the space between the front log wall and the interior finish with dried prairie grass, a material everyone else burned or ignored. They saw her gathering and drying the grass and shook their heads at another of the widow's strange habits. The roof was the greatest challenge. It needed to be strong enough to support not just snow, but tons of earth. She laid thick beams of cottonwood, the heaviest she could manage, spacing them closely together. On top of the beams, she laid a layer of rough-sawn planks. Over the planks, she placed a layer of tanned ox hides, overlapping them carefully to create a waterproof membrane. And then came the final, most peculiar step. She began to cover the roof with the very earth she had excavated, shoveling the soil up onto the structure, creating a thick, insulating blanket of sod and dirt. She encouraged Caleb and Anna to plant the tough prairie grass roots into the new soil, so that in the spring her roof would become a living part of the hillside. To the people of Providence, it looked like she was burying her own house. "She is building her own grave," Silas muttered to his wife, watching from a distance as Aara moved the last of the earth into place, shaping the berms that rose up against the east and west walls, leaving only the south-facing front exposed. The structure seemed to disappear, to melt back into the landscape from which it came. It did not stand tall and proud, it crouched low and humble. It was the opposite of everything they believed a home should be. The final piece of her design was the hearth. Instead of a large open fireplace that consumed vast amounts of wood and sent most of its heat straight up the chimney, she built a small, efficient masonry stove in the center of the living space. It was a dense block of stone and clay, with a winding flue that snaked through the mass, designed to retain the heat of the fire and radiate it slowly and evenly into the room long after the flames had died down. It was a principle of thermal mass, the same one she was using for the entire house. The earth and stone would absorb the heat of the sun and the fire, and then release it slowly, creating a stable, gentle warmth. She finished her work just as the first snow flurries began to spin in the air. The gray sky promised a hard season. Her home was done. From the north, it was invisible, just a continuation of the rolling prairie. From the front, it was a simple log face with two small glass-paned windows and a sturdy door, tucked securely into the embrace of the hill. It was small, it was strange, but it was hers, and it was ready. The great storm did not arrive with a sudden fury. It began as a whisper, a change in the quality of the light, a deepening of the gray in the sky. The wind, which had been a constant companion, fell silent for a full day, an eerie, unsettling calm that made the animals nervous and the settlers look to the horizon. They called it the ice wolf, a storm that stalked its prey with silence before the attack. The temperature began to plummet, falling 10 degrees in an hour, then 20. The air grew so cold it felt sharp in the lungs, a pain with every breath. Then the wind returned, and it came with the force of a physical blow. It was a solid wall of motion, a screaming, relentless torrent from the Arctic that carried with it a blinding curtain of fine, hard snow. The world outside the cabins of Providence vanished. There was no sky, no land, only a roaring, white chaos. The snow was not soft and fluffy. It was granular, like sand, and it drove into every crack and crevice with the force of a sandblaster. The sun was a forgotten memory. Day and night blurred into a single, unending twilight of howling wind and suffocating snow. Inside the traditional cabins, the battle for survival began in earnest. The wind slammed against the flat, exposed walls like a battering ram. The logs groaned under the strain, and the old chinking, made brittle by the frost, gave way. Fine dustings of snow appeared on windowsills and floors, blown straight through the walls. The fires in the hearths, which should have been sources of comfort, became monsters. The wind howling over the chimneys created a powerful draft, sucking the heat out of the rooms and demanding more and more fuel. Men struggled to keep the fires fed, but it was a fool's errand. The cabins were colder than they had ever been. In Silas's home, the largest and best built in the settlement, the family huddled together around the stove. His wife was stuffing rags into the gaps that had opened in the walls, but the cold poured in like water. The windows were opaque with thick, feathery layers of frost. A barrel of potatoes in the corner, thought to be safe, was frozen solid. Silas watched his woodpile, visible through a small, clear patch on the window pane, shrink with terrifying speed. He had thought he had enough for 2 winters. He now realized he might not have enough for 2 weeks. He felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. His expertise, his pride, the very foundation of his identity in the community, was failing. He was failing his family. He heard his youngest daughter cough, a dry, hacking sound that sent a spike of fear through him. Word could not travel, but the suffering was universal. In every cabin, the story was the same. Families ran out of wood, or were forced to ration it so severely that the fires dwindled to a few pathetic embers. They burned furniture. They burned fence posts. They huddled under mountains of blankets, shivering uncontrollably, listening to the wind, trying to tear their homes apart. The cold was an invading army, and their wooden forts had been breached. They were surrounded, besieged, and their supplies were running out. The hope that had carried them to this land was freezing, crystallizing into despair. In Aara's earthen home, there was quiet. Outside, the same storm raged. The wind screamed over the roof, but it found no flat wall to push against. It flowed over the curved, snow-covered mound as it would over any other hill. The tons of earth and snow on the roof formed a layer of insulation so profound that the chaos of the outside world was muffled to a distant, ignorable hum. The house was not fighting the storm. It was sleeping through it. Inside, a small, steady fire glowed in the masonry stove. Aara had fed it only a few logs that morning, and the heated stone now radiated a gentle, pervasive warmth. There were no drafts. The air was still and calm. The temperature held at a comfortable 60 degrees, a miracle in the frozen world. Anna and Caleb were playing on a rug on the floor, their cheeks rosy, untroubled by the elemental war being waged just a few feet above their heads. The smell of baking bread filled the small space, a scent of life and normalcy. Aara moved about her home with a calm purpose, her actions unhurried. The earth, her silent partner, was holding them safe in its steady embrace. The principles from her father's book were not just theory. They were a living, breathing reality. It worked. The storm raged for 3 days and 3 nights. On the 4th morning, the wind finally broke. A profound, ringing silence fell over the plains, the silence of a world buried in snow. The sky cleared to a brilliant, painful blue, and the sun shone on a landscape transformed, a sea of white drifts and sculpted ice. But the cold did not leave with the wind. It deepened, settling into the land with a deadly stillness. The temperature was 40 below zero. In the cabins of Providence, the silence was a reprieve, but the cold was now an even greater threat. Without the wind to drive it, the cold simply sank, seeping into everything. Their fuel was gone, their walls were breached, and their bodies were weakened. Desperation began to set in. It was Silas who acted first. His firewood was completely gone, and his daughter's cough had worsened. He knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that she would not survive another night in his perfectly built, fatally flawed cabin. There was only one place to go, a foolish, desperate hope. He had to see if the widow had somehow survived. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned and stepped out into the brutal cold. The snow was waist-deep, and he had to fight for every step. The air was so cold it burned his throat. He struggled toward the low rise where Aara had built her strange home. As he got closer, he saw no sign of life. The structure was just a smooth, white mound, indistinguishable from the surrounding drifts. A terrible feeling of guilt and despair washed over him. He had been so sure she would fail. He had mocked her, abandoned her. He feared he was about to find a tomb of his own making. Then he saw it. A thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke rising from a small stone chimney that barely poked above the snow. It was not the thick, panicked plume of smoke from his own chimney, but a calm, steady breath. Hope, sharp and painful, surged through him. He fought his way to the front of the structure, to the south-facing wall. He saw the door, mostly clear of snow, shielded by the clever angle of the roof. He raised a numb, frozen hand and knocked. The door opened, and a wave of warm air washed over him. It was so unexpected, so profoundly different from the world he had just left, that he staggered back a step. Aara stood in the doorway, her face calm. Behind her, he could see her children playing on the floor. They were not bundled in coats, they were in simple shirts. He saw no frost on the interior walls. He heard no wind whistling through cracks. He smelled baking bread. He stared, speechless, his mind unable to reconcile the peaceful, warm scene before him with the frozen hell he inhabited. "Silas," Aara said, her voice even, without a trace of triumph or accusation. "You are freezing. Come in." He stumbled inside, and she closed the door, shutting out the deadly cold. The warmth enveloped him. It was not a scorching, dry heat from a roaring fire, but a steady, gentle warmth that seemed to come from the very walls, the floor, the air itself. He looked at the small masonry stove, where a few glowing embers lay. He could not understand. "Your fire, it is almost out," he stammered, his teeth chattering. "The stove and the walls hold the heat for many hours," she explained simply, handing him a warm mug of tea. "We have used less than half a cord of wood this winter." Half a cord. The words hit him like a physical blow. He had burned through more than 3 cords already, and had nothing to show for it but a frozen house and a sick child. The stark contrast between his failure and her success was laid bare in that small, warm room. He looked at the smooth interior walls, the solid ceiling, the calm faces of her children. He saw the wisdom he had dismissed, the knowledge he had mocked. He saw a solution to a problem he had thought was insurmountable. He was wrong. He was profoundly, dangerously wrong. He did not boast. He did not say, "I told you so." Aara simply moved with a quiet grace, offering him a seat on a small wooden bench near the stove. She cut a thick slice of the fresh bread and handed it to him. The simple act of hospitality, of offering sustenance in the face of his utter failure, broke through his pride. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate, dawning understanding. He, the master builder, the leader of the community, had built a beautiful, admirable failure. She, the quiet widow, had built an odd, humble masterpiece of survival. "My daughter is sick," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have no more wood. Our cabin, it is as cold as the outdoors." It was a confession, an admission of defeat. He was not just a neighbor, he was a supplicant. Aara nodded slowly. "Bring your family here," she said. It was not a question. It was a simple statement of fact. There is room. It is warm. Her triumph was not in words, but in this quiet, powerful act of grace. She did not need to remind him of his mockery. His presence in her home was reminder enough. Her victory was in the steady, life-giving warmth of the room, in the healthy flush on her children's cheeks, in the simple, undeniable fact that her way had worked when his had failed so catastrophically. Silas returned to his cabin, his mind reeling. He gathered his wife and children, who were shivering violently under a pile of blankets, and led them through the snow to Aara's earthen home. Entering the small dwelling was like stepping into another world. Silas's wife wept with relief at the feeling of the steady, gentle heat. Aara welcomed them without fanfare, making a space for the family and giving the sick child a warm broth. That night, for the first time in days, the builder's family slept soundly, protected not by thick logs and misplaced pride, but by packed earth and the quiet wisdom of a woman they had scorned. The next day, the news began to spread. Another family, the Millers, ran out of wood, and seeing the light in Aara's windows the night before, made a desperate journey to her home. They arrived, half frozen and expecting to find a grim scene, only to be met with the same shocking warmth and calm. They, too, were taken in. Word, carried by desperate fathers and freezing sons, moved slowly through the buried settlement. The story was always the same. The widow's strange mud house was an oasis of warmth in the frozen desert of Providence. One by one, more families made the trek. Aara's small home became a refugee camp, crowded with the very people who had laughed at its construction. They huddled together in the life-saving warmth, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and overwhelming gratitude. The derisive laughter was gone, replaced by a profound and humbled silence. They looked at the thick earthen walls, at the clever stove, at the low, strong roof, and they finally understood. They had been trying to conquer the prairie winter. Aara had simply asked for its shelter. When the worst of the cold snap finally broke, and the families could safely return to their own frigid cabins, something had fundamentally changed in the settlement of Providence. The social order had been upended. The master builder was no longer the sole authority. The quiet widow, the outsider, had become the settlement's most vital source of wisdom. It was Silas who came to her first, alone, after he had settled his family back in their own home. He did not come with thanks, though his gratitude was etched on his face. He came with a question. He stood before her, his hat in his hands, his pride stripped away, leaving only a raw and honest humility. "How?" he asked. It was a simple word, but it contained a universe of meaning. "How did you know? How does it work? How can we learn?" He did not ask for a share of her food or a place by her fire. He asked for her knowledge. It was the ultimate act of surrender and respect. Aara took him outside, into the brilliant, cold sunlight. She picked up a stick the same way she had months before. But this time, when she drew in the snow, he did not see foolishness. He saw genius. She drew the cross-section of the wall, explaining the air gap and the stone footing. She explained how the earth acted like a great stone, absorbing the sun's heat during the day and radiating it back through the night. She explained how the low profile of the house gave the wind nothing to grip. She shared her knowledge as freely and generously as she had shared her warmth. She did not ask for payment or praise. The earnest, focused attention of the man who had led the chorus of mockery against her was payment enough. Silas became her first and most dedicated student. He spent hours with her, studying the drawings in her father's book, asking questions, and absorbing the principles that had been so alien to him before. He learned about orientation, insulation, and thermal mass. He learned that the strength of a home was not in how tall it stood, but in how cleverly it fit into the world around it. Soon others followed. The same men who had scoffed at her mud hole now came to her door, seeking her guidance. She taught them all. She held informal lessons, drawing diagrams on a piece of slate, explaining the simple physics of heat and cold. She showed them how to build the masonry stove, how to create the waterproof membrane for the roof, how to properly berm the walls with earth. There was no arrogance in her teaching, only a patient desire to share what she knew, to ensure that no one in Providence would ever have to suffer through a winter like that again. The community, humbled by its near-fatal ignorance, became a collective of eager pupils. That spring, a new sound filled the air in Providence. It was not the sound of axes felling trees for another flawed log cabin. It was the sound of shovels and spades, of men digging into the earth. Under Aara's quiet guidance, the settlement began to rebuild. Silas, a changed man, led the first crew, excavating a hollow in a hillside for the Miller family. He followed her design with the meticulous care of a convert, laying a proper stone foundation, building the thick retaining walls, and leaving the crucial air gap. The landscape of the settlement began to change. One by one, new earthen homes appeared, nestled into the slopes, their low profiles and living roofs blending into the prairie. The old log cabins, monuments to a failed tradition, were dismantled, their timbers repurposed for the forward-facing walls and roof beams of the new, wiser structures. The settlement was no longer a collection of defiant wooden boxes perched precariously on the plains. It was becoming a part of the land itself, a community that had learned to bend with the wind instead of breaking before it. The story of Providence and the widow's warm house traveled beyond the settlement. A surveyor, passing through the following year, was astonished to find the unique and efficient homes. He took notes and sketches, and the tale appeared in a newspaper back east, a curious anecdote from the frontier. Travelers and new settlers, hearing the story, would often seek out Providence to see the homes for themselves. The idea began to spread, a quiet revolution of common sense, carried by word of mouth from one settlement to another. The design became known in the region simply as a Providence house. They did not name it after Aara. She would not have wanted that. The name was a testament to the fact that the entire community had embraced the lesson she had taught them. Aara lived out her days in Providence, a respected and beloved elder. She never sought a position of leadership, and she never once reminded anyone of their initial mockery. She didn't have to. The proof of her wisdom was in the warm, safe homes that filled the valley. Her legacy was written not in books or on monuments, but in the very earth of the place she had made her home. It was in the laughter of children who no longer feared the winter. In the sight of thin wisps of smoke rising from the chimneys of homes that were safe and warm, and in the quiet humility of a community that had learned its most important lesson not from a preacher or a politician, but from a quiet widow with a spade, a book, and an unshakable faith in a wiser way to live. The story reminds us that true wisdom is often quiet, residing not in the loudest voice or the most popular opinion, but in careful observation, deep-rooted knowledge, and the courage to choose a different path. It teaches that our greatest strength is not found in fighting the world with brute force, but in understanding its rhythms and learning to move with them. The harshest trials can become our greatest teachers, stripping away our pride and opening our eyes to truths we were too stubborn to see, revealing that the most revolutionary ideas are sometimes buried in the earth, waiting for a humble hand to bring them to light. If this story reminded you of the power of quiet resilience, share it with someone who believes in the strength of humble wisdom. And follow for more enduring stories of courage, survival, and ingenuity.